Hi, everybody. We are going to be talking about description for the personal narrative. So I am going to just set my PowerPoint up here if it will go. Come on, there we go. So you'll need a few documents to help you through this presentation. I would like you to go into content, into the description folder that's under week 3, part 1. And I would like you to print out the document description for the personal narrative. You're also going to need the document father, and then I would also like you to gather your mentor texts from last week. I'm going to specifically be referring to school days and what white food meant to a first generation kid. I'm going to be referencing specific examples from those two texts. So for sure have those two, but it might also be nice to have The Good Daughter and The Good Daughter and The Physics of Forbidden Love as well. So you can take a look through those and see how those authors communicate description through their words as well. So go ahead, you can stop this presentation, go find your documents, and come on back. Okay, so now we are going to talk about the handout description for the personal narrative. If you haven't had a chance, I would like you to skim this document. This document was made for a face-to-face class, so it might be a little bit off. I did not retype it for this class because I thought that you could handle a little bit of translation problem there. So the first thing I want you to look at on this document is the definition. The definition for the personal narrative is vivid description creates an intense, distinctive image, one that seems to bring words to life. Writers use description to help their audience feel the associated feelings that link with whatever they are describing. Writers use description to give readers an impression of people, places, and things to make them memorable and to support an argument. Word choice focusing on the 5 senses is of the utmost importance in order to make a dominant impression that the audience can experience and visualize. So what I really want you to take away from that definition is that you're going to provide enough description detail so that the audience that is going to read your paper will feel the same feelings that you felt in the situation that you're writing about in your personal narrative. They will see what you see. They will hear what you heard. They will feel what you felt, okay? It is all of those. It's like you're trying to place the reader in the place you were, in your place, while you write your personal narrative. And that's the hardest part, is to get the reader that engaged, that they're feeling the same feelings that you felt. So I'm sure you've all read a book at some point where you felt like you were the main character of that book. And when you were the main character of that book, anything that happened to that character, you felt it. So when I was in 5th grade, my 5th grade teacher read aloud Where the Red Fern Grows. And I don't know if you've ever read that book, but it is about a boy who has a dog. And it was in 5th grade, which was a long time ago, and I won't read it again because at the end, I don't remember if it was 1 dog or 2 dogs. I somehow think it was 2 dogs. But at the end, the dogs die, right? And I remember sitting in my 5th grade classroom, and one other person besides me, we were bawling at the end because I felt what the little boy felt when he lost his dogs, and I'm a dog person. So that devastated me that the dogs died at the end. It was sort of embarrassing in 5th grade to be one of 2 people crying in the classroom, but the author did a really good job of placing me in the context, in the situation that the character was in. And so that's what you are being tasked with during this personal narrative. So one of the ways that we can deal with with description is through structure. And so we've already talked a little bit about how to organize your paper and how different acts can go different places, but you definitely can tell a story through time. So that can be a structure that you can use for your description, is describing how things happen in time. You can also do episodic grouping, which is when you take different scenarios that will stay with the same dominant impression, and I'll talk about a dominant impression in a few minutes. But if it has the same dominant impression, but there are different episodes that kind of make the reader feel the same dominant impression that kind of surrounds whatever you're talking about, that's another way to organize your essay. And that is sort of what School Days does. She talks about the assimilation when she moved to America, and then she has 3 really specific examples of what happened to her. And so those 3 acts they're not necessarily chronological, but they're definitely episodic in their grouping. Then there's also just ways of movement. So eye movement almost, that you can organize your text. So it can be approaching. So if I wanted to describe my house, so I'm going to describe my house, and maybe I want to describe what it's like when I get to go home after a long day at work. And I might describe that in an approaching way, where I describe once I make it to the hill, and I know that I'm going up the hill, I know that I'm almost home. And the hill is surrounded by trees, and so it's almost like the trees form a tunnel that I drive through. And especially in the fall, it's beautiful, and it makes me feel like I am going through kind of this magic place that transcends where I am from work to home. So when I go through that tunnel, it kind of transforms my whole point of view, right? Or you can do it from the bird as the bird flies. So that you just have to think about a bird flying in the sky looking down, right? And you could see like the map, and you could see where my house was, and you could see where the school is. And so then you can see how that all transpires. You can also do some scanning. So if you're going to describe something when you're looking from left to right, you're going to, whatever you see on the left, and then you describe as you scan to the right. And that's the same with right to left, right? You just go the other way, top to bottom. Maybe if I wanted to describe like the Empire State Building or something, I could describe what it looked like on top, and then I could describe as I scan down to the bottom. Near to far as well, right? It's all kind of the same thing. The center to the edge, that's a really interesting point of view to talk about. It starts from the middle of something and then it spreads out. And there's an example that I'm going to talk about later with that. So this is all about structure, how to structure a personal narrative and how to structure your description within it. So we're going to move on here. And these are the most important 4 components of description. These are the things that I'm going to ask you to be looking for in your mentor texts. And I'm also going to be asking you to make sure that when you're drafting your personal narrative, that you're going back and using this as sort of a revision strategy. Can you name things? Naming is nouns, right? Naming is especially proper nouns. So if you remember in the white food essay, what white food meant to the first generation kid, Lisa Coe does a great job in this essay naming things. She names everything. It brings I grew up in the 80s. It brings me right back to the 80s. I remember a lot of the things that she names. So for example, when in paragraph 4, when she's talking about the year was 1986. I was 10 years old and my family was on the fast track to expert level American. We were the first on our block to get a microwave where my mother said we could zap and nuke our food. And those words are iconic 80s words, but they're so specific to the time period and they're great descriptors, right? I remember my mom saying, just zap it for 2 minutes. I totally remember that. Or I'm going to nuke the potatoes for a couple, like those were words that were very fluently spoken during that time. So that brings me back. That's a historical reference, just using those words, and that word choice is amazing. So we could zap and nuke our food. Breakfast was a fat slice of zapped Sara Lee frozen pound cake. So here we have the name Sara Lee, right? It's not just a pound cake. It's Sara Lee's pound cake. That's really important. That name brand, that adds to this essay and the so what of this essay. So she named that. She also named Swanson's Hungry Man TV dinners. So there's another name that's a proper noun. Those are the naming part, right? She named a bunch of stuff like Cheetos and Pringles and Nestle iced tea powder, right? All of these things, all throughout the whole essay, she's naming specific things. There's a combos baked snacks later on. She names the Cosby Show and Dallas and Dynasty and The Price is Right, right? She names all of these things because it centers you in history and it also pulls you right into her writing. So naming is going to be really important. Yeah, the next thing is detailing. The more details you can bring in, the better your reader is going to be able to see what you see. So these are all adjectives, right? These are the adjectives that are going to describe what you're talking about. So, for example, when she is detailing, she's saying unsweetened applesauce. That's a huge detail. That adjective of unsweetened, this is the contrast between what she ate in her house to be American and what her American born friends ate in their house. And it was unsweetened applesauce, baked chicken breasts, celery sticks, right? Occasionally a single oatmeal cookie from an actual cookie jar. That is very different than how she ate at her house. That is my dog scratching in the background. I'm so sorry. He's laying by my feet and he decided he had an itch, and that is his collar jingling. And there's some description for you so you know what that weird sound is in the back. Anyway, so that's the other part of description, is really getting all of those details so people can see and smell and feel what you feel. So Lisa Coe does a good job of both of those in this essay. The next thing is comparing. So this is where we're talking about figurative language, using metaphor, simile, personification, occasionally some allusion. So you are comparing things, and that can make the essay beautiful, because that's beautiful language can be used. But you have to be very, very careful, because sometimes if you use metaphors in a cliche way, it takes away from what you're saying. So you need to be very careful when you're using figurative language because you want it to be powerful and not cliche. Okay, the last thing is sensory description. So the sensory description that's how you're going to communicate all of the feeling part, right? If you are naming and detailing and comparing how people see things, how people feel things, how people taste things, how people hear things, how people smell things, that is going to bring your reader into your into your narrative as well. So that sensory detail is really important, that sensory description, the five senses, to really look at any situation with all five senses and try and describe all of those senses. So those are the four components of description. On the screen, you will see that there is a TED Ed video on descriptive writing. This is a video, so you can't click on it to get there, but I did link it in our description folder on D2L in content, so you can get there. And just a little warning with this one, this is all about fictional writing, but it definitely can transfer into your personal narrative, which is nonfiction. It's the same kind of thing. So just try and expand that. Excuse me. All right, so we're going to move on here, and we're going to talk about dominant impression, because in a personal narrative, there's always a dominant impression when you're doing a description. So your description is going to have an overall feeling that the reader is going to be able to understand from what you write in your narrative. So I'm going to give you an example of the state fair. Okay, I go to the state fair maybe every couple years. When my kids were little, we went every year to see the animals mostly. But the dominant impression that I always get is, if you can look, I don't know if this will work, but if you can look in this lower right hand corner here, this is always kind of my dominant impression. Whenever I think about the fair, I think about masses of humanity, and it's really crowded and it's hard to move, and I kind of feel claustrophobic, and I always have to stand in line for everything. If I want my Pronto Pup, I have to wait for 15 minutes in a line, and then I have to wait for them to make it. And so being in that crowded space is always my dominant impression. And all of those things that I just named, those are the things that I would write about to create a dominant impression for the reader. I would talk about being jostled because people were right next to me, or trying to walk and tripping over a stroller, or having somebody run into me. And usually it's pretty hot at the fair because that time of year is kind of hot. So maybe somebody who would bump into me and they're all sweaty and gross and all that, and being just worrying about losing my kids because they'll be swallowed up in the crowd. All of those things, that's what I would focus on. So anybody that was reading what I was writing with the dominant impression of those fair being crowded would be able to feel what it feels like to be in a crowd, and to be claustrophobic, and to be like everything slows down because you're in this huge crowd, right? But maybe somebody else would have a different dominant impression. So if you go over here, this is where the animals are born, and I can't remember the exact name of this building. Shoot, is it like the Life Barn or something? I don't remember. And I'm trying to see if you can read it there, but I can't read it. So anyway, my kids loved this place. This is where you went in and you could see like pigs being born. There's always a cow in labor, and somebody had, they were elbow deep inside a pig or whatever. My kids absolutely were enthralled. And then they had the little baby ducks and the little baby chicks, and there was always little babies everywhere. So this dominant impression, maybe especially if it was a hot day, this dominant impression might be it's really stinky at the fair, and all of the manure that's on the floor, and a pig giving birth might be kind of, there might be some bodily fluids that might smell bad, right? So that might be your dominant impression. If you're going to the cookie place, right? Martha's Cookies. Is it Martha's? I think it is. If you're going to get some chocolate chip cookies, your dominant impression might be that you've been craving those cookies all year and you just can't wait to sink your teeth into all of the chocolatey goodness, right? And maybe that treat of having Martha's Cookies and a glass of milk is what you can't wait to do at the fair. So maybe that would be your dominant impression, is how delicious the fair was, and see, then maybe that piece of corn would go along with that. So it depends on what perspective you want to communicate to the reader. Your dominant impression can change even if it's the same place. So that's what I'm trying to communicate to you here, is that you have to figure out what the dominant impression is that you want to communicate, and then you're going to use the detailing and the naming and the figurative language and the sensory detail to communicate that feeling, that dominant impression. And the dominant impression of a description is kind of like the main idea of an expository text, like a thesis statement, except it's more of a feeling. Okay, it's kind of like a claim in an argument, except it's for a description, so it's called a dominant impression. It's what the overall text is trying to communicate. All right, so the next thing you're going to do is you're going to read the text Father. Now, this text is a description, and I want you to look for dominant impression. What is the dominant impression that this author, I think her name is Jan, but I cannot remember her last name, and it's not right in front of me. Hold on, let me see if I can find it. Pretty sure I had it just a second ago. I'm not going to find it. But the author does do a great job of creating a dominant impression. So what is that dominant impression? I want you to figure that out. I also want you to take note when you're annotating this of what kind of details are they using? What are they naming, and what kind of details is this author using? Okay, so that's what you're annotating for. You're also going to annotate for any figurative language. What kind of figurative language do they use? And what kinds of things are they doing for structure? How are they structuring this piece? Her name is Jan Gray. I found it. So Jan Gray, how did she structure her description? What did she do? How did she use sensory detail? Okay, so make sure that you're looking for all of those components for description. And so you're going to turn off the presentation, go read and annotate for all of the description look-fors, and then come back here and we'll talk about it. All right, here is the essay. I could have just clicked, but I didn't. So first of all, what I want to talk about in this essay is structure first. So in the very first paragraph, it says, "My father's hands are grotesque." So you can see that that's a short sentence, and it's naming and describing, right? His hands are grotesque. And that is really what her dominant impression is of his hands. Her father's hands are grotesque. So, and then you can see how she describes that. He suffers from psoriasis. That's a naming, right? It's naming the disease. And then she describes the disease. It's a chronic skin disease that covers his massive, this is adjectives, right? This is details. Massive, thick hands with scaly, reddish patches. That's all kinds of detail, right? And it's also sensory detail. So you can, like, scaly and red, right? You can almost see that. That periodically flake off, sending tiny pieces of dead skin sailing to the ground. So right now, you're thinking gross. And that's what she wants you to think about, because her dominant impression is her father's hands are grotesque. It says, in addition, his fingers are permanently stained with a dull yellow from years of chain smoking. The thought of those swollen, what a great adjective that is, swollen, discolored, scaly hands touching me, whether it be out of love or anger, sends chills up my spine. So she does a really great job of using sensory detail. You can see what she's seeing. You can feel how she feels like she's revolted by him. She does not want him to touch her. You can see his hands as well. So she is showing and not telling, right? So she does a really great job describing his hands here. And she has a really great dominant impression, which is stated. So then the next paragraph goes on, and it says, by nature, he is a disorderly, unkept person. The numerous cigarette burns, food stains, and ashes on his clothes show how little he cares about his appearance. So now we have gone from his hands, and we're zooming out a little bit, and now it's for his whole body, right? It's about his appearance. It talks about his hands running through his greasy hair, scratching his scalp, causing dandruff to drift downward onto his bulky shoulders, right? These are great descriptions. He's overweight, grossly overweight. Do you notice how she used the word gross again? That repetition from grotesque is intentional. And his pullover shirts never cover his protruding paunch, and that alliteration is awesome. When he eats, he shovels the food into his mouth as if he hadn't eaten for days, the breadcrumbs and food scraps settling in his untrimmed beard. So we start with his hands. We zoom out and we talk about how gross his body is. And you're still saying gross, right? And then she goes into his apartment, right? So she's there dusting and vacuuming. That's what she's thinking that she has to do. But then when she opens the door, she realized that, she says, I realized my task was monumental. This is paragraph 3, right? Old yellowed newspapers and magazines were strewn throughout the living room. Moldy and rotten food covered the kitchen counter. Cigarette butts and ashes were everywhere. The pungent aroma of stale beer seemed to fill the entire apartment. So now you're in his apartment saying, gross. She's doing a great job of doing a lot of sensory detail here. Not as much naming, but yellowed newspaper, magazines. She could have named it. It doesn't matter at this point because she's doing such a great job of having us picture what that apartment would look like. And she does a great job of zooming out to that. So hands, body, apartment. So that's how she begins her set. And that is, if you remember, and I wonder, yep, I'm just going to move back here and I'm going to show you. Remember this? This would be center to edge, starting with the hands spreading out, right? So that's her structure at this point. And now we'll go back to the essay. So now she's going to switch her structure a little bit, and she's going to talk about how he treats her, right? So she goes to this little scenario right here. I was calling home to tell my mother I'd be eating dinner at a girlfriend's house, and he answers, right? And then it talks about this this episode where he like trashes her room because she doesn't get home fast enough. And that's a gross way to treat her too, right? You're thinking, what a jerk. What reason does he have to even do that? And he's not even supposed to be there. He doesn't live there anymore. So what right does he have to trash her room because she's not home at the time that he decides that she needs to be home? So that's an episodic thing, but what it does is it zooms out even more. I'm going to cough now, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Excuse me. So it goes from his hands to his body to his apartment to how he treats people. So he is gross. And so that goes to the dominant impression of the whole article or the whole essay, is that her father is grotesque. And that's the dominant impression. Through the whole essay, you are thinking, this guy is disgusting, right? That is her impression that she wants you to get. And then her so what at the very end, as I sat in his bedroom reflecting on what he had done to my room, I felt the utmost disgust for this man. There seemed to be no hope that he would break his filthy habits. What a great word choice with filthy. I could come in and clean his room, but only he could clean up the mess he had made of his life. Awesome, powerful. But I felt pity for him too. After all, he is my father. Am I not supposed to feel some responsibility for him and to love and honor him? So she's feeling quite guilty that she is disgusted by her father. And that is her so what? Like she has this sort of conflict that he is this gross person, and she knows it. Every part of him is gross, but he's her father, and she should love him, and there's some guilt there. So there is the so what at the end. Okay, so that is a great description. And by the way, this is a student essay that was written by a freshman in college, so it can be done. You can do a very good job and maybe be a model text for somebody else. All right, so we're going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about our other mentor texts now. Okay, so my question is, how did our authors incorporate description? And so you're going to turn off the presentation again, and I want you to look at all of the mentor texts. I want you to look at how they incorporated description into their texts. And they're the same look-fors that we did before. How did they do it? Where was their naming? And I already talked about naming in the white food essay, but how was their naming in the other ones? Where is their figurative language? Are there any similes or metaphors or personification, allusions? Where are the sensory details? Where are all of the five senses? How are they being portrayed through their texts? And how is it structured? Are they doing it through time? Are they doing an episodic structure? Are they going from one central part outwards? Are they scanning, like looking from where the bird flies? How are they doing description? What structure did they use? And then, of course, what is the dominant impression as you're reading? When you're reading the description, what are you feeling? How are they making you feel, and what is that dominant impression? Okay, so pause the presentation, go reread, and if I would have your pencil out and annotate for this. This will only help you with your own personal narrative. That's why these are called mentor texts. They're mentors, just like they're sitting next to you saying, write like this. And you don't have to write exactly like them, but if there's something that the one author or two authors or five authors do, you can absolutely steal that style and try it out in your own essay. That's the whole point of a mentor text. So go ahead, off you go, do some annotations and look for those components of description. All right, so I'm going to go through um, white food because white food, they do just such a great, she does a great job of incorporating description. Okay, so bear with me. I have my essay out. I hope you have your essay out, and then of course there's one on the screen. So I already have talked about how the naming is excellent in this. All of these, Swanson's Hungry Man, I've already said all of this really. There's a lot about Spam on this page. I love Spam. It's so delicious, right? Um, all of the naming, MTV, HBO, Cinemax, the movie channel, all of this naming is excellent. Excellent job with that. So I would like you to specifically look at paragraph 4 right now, and so you can see what I was talking about. And I think I read this already to you, but you can see that the naming here is fantastic. And same with the Zap and the Nuke. I've already talked about that. I don't see, I was too excited before. Down here, it says, for my parents, American was often synonymous with white, but the food of my white friends ate wasn't anything like the food on TV commercials. So that is significant, right? So American equals white. And notice how the contrast is about the applesauce, the unsweetened applesauce, and the baked chicken breast, and the celery sticks, and the occasional cookie, compared to what she was eating, right? She was eating the TV dinners and the pound cake for breakfast and the corn niblets, mashed potatoes, and fudge brownies that go into that Hungry Man dinner, which are details, right? French bread pizzas, and all of those things that she was eating, it was all junk food. It was all processed junk food. And then her American friends were eating kind of nutritious food. And that is an interesting contrast, that even though American meant white, her white friends were eating very differently than they were than the food was portrayed like on TV and TV commercials, or even on the advertisements on the packaging. So that's interesting. She also named a bunch of TV shows, and she named the combos baked snacks, and so there's just a whole whole lot of naming. There we go. Sorry about that. The structure here is episodic, right? It's the beginning is kind of setting the scene of her home, and then there's the background about her parents. Then it talks about TV a little bit, and then it talks about her friends and her relationships with her friends. So that is more of an episodic way of grouping things to tell the story and to describe the story. Okay. I'm just looking at my notes here. So I'm going to go to the so what, which is the meaningful thing that she's learned, and that's what she's really writing about here. And that's in the last 3 paragraphs. And these last 3 paragraphs are pretty powerful. So I'm going to read them, and then we'll talk about the last 3 paragraphs, and then we'll try and figure out that dominant impression that she is writing about. It's a little tricky in this essay, so I want to talk about it. So the last 3 paragraphs, I'm going to start here. One dominant narrative of immigration paints a rosy picture of 2 cultures melting together through food. Like my mother stuffing our Thanksgiving turkey with sticky rice. What a great description. That totally illustrates this melting together of cultures, right? But in reality, assimilation is more violent. And that's an interesting word choice, right? When you think of violence, you don't necessarily think about assimilating to another culture. So when you think of violence, it means it hurts, right? History is more complex and cultures less disparate. I'd hungrily devoured what I had believed to be American normalcy. So notice how she's using the word hunger, devoured, right? Hungrily devoured. That's what you'd use for food. And now she's not talking about food. That's amazing. So she'd hungrily devoured what I had believed to be American normalcy. The normalcy would be the food that she was eating, right? But I was still seen as American adjacent. That's a fantastic word choice. And the alliteration there it works so well. It's beautiful. Maybe there was no such thing as American normalcy. Or maybe the normalcy was in itself a performance. Now, that whole thing about a performance is powerful, right? A performance. Eventually, the food I'd gorged on with its cheery packaging and bright colors made me sick, and I developed food allergies and chronic autoimmune issues. These days, a slice of pizza or a handful of Doritos will give me hives for a week. So this is also an interesting consequence of that. And isn't it? And she was just trying to be American, and that made her sick, right? Literally sick. Yet once in a while, I feel the sharp envy for people who can eat whatever they want with no repercussions, though maybe it's only envy for the innocence of 1986, an innocence that never truly existed, and how I used to make a beeline for the burger stand at the mall food court. Extra cheese, onion rings, a milkshake to wash it all down, or eat a microwaved dinner, the food never tasting quite as good as the shiny pictures on the box appeared, in front of a blaring TV, unable to look away. So these 3 paragraphs relate all the way back up here to what she talks about with James Baldwin, right? And actually over here too. She wanted to watch The Sale of the Century, to be handed a suitcase of money and showered with balloons like the New York Lotto cards my father brought home every week, and the Wingo game cards that I filled out on the back of pages of the New York Post game shows were pure possibility. Everyone could be a winner. Everyone could get rich quick, right? And so that whole American dream part, that whole like if you're lucky you'll just make it, that's an interesting thing that she contrasts from. She contrasts from all of these other things to how everybody can be a winner and everybody can get rich quick. And then there's James Baldwin here. James Baldwin wrote that American media is designed not to trouble, but to reassure. What an interesting concept of that, right? To reassure. So when we watch TV, we don't want to be troubled. We want to be reassured that everything's okay. American movies and TV shows help sustain a fantasy of innocence that masks our country's violence. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie refers to America's addiction to comfort. I'm not exactly sure how to say this first name. So Diaz, I'm just going to use Diaz because I don't want to say it wrong. They talk about our commitment to the narrative of consolation, the soothing myth of America exceptionalism depends on maintaining its comfort and innocence, however false. Perhaps my childhood did too. After all, my family had the privilege to remain superficially apolitical, to attempt to distance ourselves mentally and geographically from the devastation of the Reagan years. So we're talking about James Baldwin, who is an African American he was an advocate, he was an activist who talked about racism in very frank ways where people didn't like it very much. And then she's also talking about how Americans just want everything to be cool. Everything's fine. There's no trouble. If there's somebody talking about trouble, you're like, hey man, just be grateful. We live in America and we have freedom and we're all good. Because we want to be reassured all the time. And we want to have this fantasy of innocence like, we don't know. We don't know what's going on. Interesting. So that's what she's referencing down here as she talks about the dominant narrative of immigration. Okay, so here is the dominant impression of this whole thing is that America is an illusion. The food that we sell in their shiny packages that look so good aren't ever as good when we're eating them as they look on the packaging, right? And we watch TV to be reassured that everything is great all the time, even if it's not. So America is an illusion. That's our dominant impression, okay? And then that whole hungrily devoured thing, that is our so what, okay? So she did such a fantastic job using such great description in this piece. So we'll go on and we're going to move on to this is School Days, and I've just snipped out a couple paragraphs here, and I love this essay so much. She is just, her writing is beautiful. It's fantastic. So I have paragraph 3, and I want to talk about this simile right here. It says, at 6 years of age, I lived in a world of confusion. The language, the kids, the culture spun around me like a vortex. So this word vortex right here, what a perfect word in the perfect spot for that. And that vortex, it's a simile. It gives you the feeling of the swirling of confusion, and it has sort of a tornado effect, kind of like you're stuck in a like Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz, right? This swirling vortex. And that is wonderful. It's fantastic. And it also leads to paragraph 5. And I didn't really even realize I was saying it until I said it about Dorothy spinning in the tornado. So I've just made this connection right now in front of you. It says, I intuitively knew that the person I leaned on for everything, my mother, would not be able to help me. She relied heavily on her own experiences as the basis of understanding the world, just as the Wizard of Oz had nothing in his bag for Dorothy. She had nothing to smooth this assimilation for me. So here's the Wizard of Oz, right? And this is an illusion. She is comparing her mother to the Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz who is behind the curtain. Remember, for those of you who've seen it, the Wizard of Oz, they go down the yellow brick road. It's this big, adventure, and they have to kill the witch, and there's a bunch of things that they have to get through. They get to the end of the yellow brick road, and they're in Oz, and they finally find the Wizard of Oz, and he's just a man behind a curtain. And after they find him out, he goes and he gets his bag, and he has things to help everybody except for Dorothy. So he gives the lion courage, and he gives the Tin Man a heart, and he gives the scarecrow a brain, right? So he has something in his bag for all 3 of them, but then when he goes in his bag, there's nothing for Dorothy, and all she wants to do is go home. So then they have to call in Glenda the Good Witch, and she gets Dorothy to go home with Toto, right? The Wizard of Oz doesn't. So she's referencing the Wizard of Oz and comparing him to her mother, who also has nothing to help her to get through this assimilation. It is fantastic, and it relates all the way back to the vortex thing that I didn't even realize until I was talking to you about it. So that is super cool. And then if we look at paragraph 9, paragraph 9 is this great personification of language and how the English language is hiding. So here, I just saw it. Where did it go? The English language revealed itself to me. Revealed itself means it's hiding, right? That's personifying the language. It's coming out and revealing itself. And then, let's see, words. Oh, here. Words empowered me as I pursued their secrets. So those secrets, that is, that's another metaphor for this sort of elusive language that's hiding, right? And then there was another spot. What else did I want to say? Oh yeah, here. Every new word and every definition was like lifting a layer of film from my eyes, giving me clarity to see the world around me. So here again is my husband's yelling. I'm so sorry. Here again is this personifying that it's lifting a layer of film from my eyes, right? The language is lifting, and that's personifying the language. So I just wanted to show you how in School Days, she does such a great job of using figurative language in a very meaningful way, not cliche at all. All right. All right, here we go. Now, here you're going to have a chance to go out and interview a place. It's time to try and write a description and practice. So, what I would like you to do is I'd like you to find a spot that's busy, that has a lot of action. I don't know, maybe your house has a lot of action. Maybe you can go to a coffee shop. Maybe you can go onto campus and go to the cafeteria at Cop Center. Maybe you have a favorite library, or maybe your work is bustling with something. I don't know. There's a bunch of places with a lot of people. I would like you to go somewhere where there's a lot of people and a lot of things happening, and spend 10 minutes with your notebook open and take notes. Focus on your 5 senses. Focus on naming and detailing. What's around? What can you name? What can you describe using adjectives? Work on comparisons. You might want to use the figurative language as a revision strategy and do that after a little bit, but if something strikes you, write it down. Scan through the last page of the description of the personal narrative for more ideas, okay? There's a whole bunch of ideas, but I want you to spend 10 minutes where you can just focus on describing everything around you. Interview a place. And when you're done interviewing your place, you're going to write a description, and you're going to start with your dominant impression. So how did it make you feel? What was your feeling? And then you're going to go into your detailing and your naming and your figurative language of comparing. Okay? So that is going to be on a discussion board, and you can do that. And I'm super excited to read it. And I think that this is the end of our presentation on description. Really try and have fun with this. This is something that is fun to play with language here. So I'm excited to read it, and I hope you have fun doing it.